Sounds good.
Whatever works best for you. Cool. So I'll just go ahead and put it up now.
All right. So welcome to the back end part of our full stack series. We're going to get started. I do want to say the installation for that was posted in the Discord. I'm going to change a little bit just because I noticed there were some issues with like certain like type or versions. So I'm going to go over that first. Let me actually share my screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm going to link this document in the chat, and we'll probably just add the link also, since this is basically everything that we're going to cover. But yes, I also have a link to the GitHub so we can actually get the starter code in case you kind of like want to start it up yourself. And also post the updated version once we have that finished after the end of today. Yes, this is basically your starter code we have so far. It includes the requirements .txt file. I basically just simplified it, so it's only the base kind of libraries we need, and installing those will kind of install all the other stuff. So it should be fine to just use this. So yes, things we're going to cover today is the backend. So the backend is consisting of two main things. It's basically the server that takes in all the requests from the front end, whether it's like getting certain data or actually sending data itself. We need to handle those types of requests and kind of do the specific things that we want to do with it. And the second part of our backend is also dealing with the database. The database is where we kind of like store information depending on what application or kind of program you're making. For our purposes, we're going to be continuing working on the trivia app that we started last time in the front end part. And we're just going to make a very simple database with all the questions and being able to connect that with our Flask backend server. And we're also going to be using something called Sql Alchemy. All right, so now Sql Alchemy allows us to write in Python and be able to connect to our database without actually having the need to know SQL code. So that makes it a lot easier and pretty much simplifies a lot of stuff. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we have our Postgres server running. And also I added some links here if you're more curious about Postgres or SQL in general, so you can take a look at those. There's like cheat sheets. I also included a fun little murder mystery SQL game that's actually pretty nice. You basically go through your database doing SQL commands to try to figure out who murdered the person. So yeah, if you want to take a look at that, go ahead. But yes, let's make sure our database is up and running. All right, so hopefully you installed Postgres on your computer. If you follow the steps with the documentation of the actual Postgres website, you should have created a user called Postgres. Now, if you didn't create a user called Postgres, just make sure you're aware of what your user is and also the password you have, because that'll be different depending on what I'm going to show. So I'm just going to use the default Postgres with no password. And I'll try to point out whenever we need to use our username and password. Only in like 2 spots, so I'll make sure to point those out. All right, so first things first, we need to have our Postgres SQL server running. All right, so what we're going to do is first make sure we have a server. All right, so the first command we're going to do is pg_ctl status. This tells us the status of our Postgres server. As you can see, there is no server running. All right, to actually start it, we're going to say pgctl start. And that'll take literally a second, get all the information and start our Postgres server. All right, so one thing to note, because we are running our database locally, we are going to be using a separate server just for the database. All right, so we have our database server running now. And if you ever want to stop it due to like it slowing down your computer or just wanting to stop it in general, the command would be pgctl stop. And it stops it, and I can confirm that no server running. So yes, let's start our server. Perfect. Awesome. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create our database. So we are going to be using a Postgresql database. This is a relational database which contains things called tables. Now we will get too in depth with the relational aspect of it, but we're going to kind of make sure that you know just enough to kind of know your way around a relational database. All right. So what we are going to do is we're going to go into pSql. So if you followed the command, the download installation of Postgres, you should have installed the command for pSql. I think on Windows, it might be slightly complicated in the sense that you have to make sure you add it to your environmental variables. But then again, you can always check the download instructions on the document. So here, I'm going to just enter pSql to go into the pSql environment. And here, I'm going to specify the user that I want to actually be inside of as, in which case is going to be -U Postgres. All right, so the default username is Postgres. So make sure you use whatever username you kind of set up. Post. Gotta make sure I spell it correctly. So yes, now I'm logged in as Postgres user, and I can do SQL stuff in here. Now, I won't cover too much SQL syntax, though I did list out some helpful commands and things that we should know. For instance, the main thing that we're going to be doing is creating the database. Pretty simple. We're just going to create database and then give it some sort of name. Other useful commands, whether it's checking our databases, checking users, being able to quit out of pSql, also connecting to a database, and also seeing the tables associated to the database. All right. So let's create that database. So as you can see, though, I have already created my database. It is called Trivia. So since I already have that, I'm going to actually drop my database so I have a fresh database to work with. So I'm going to say drop database Trivia. And that'll drop my database. So now when I take a look at my databases, I don't have my Trivia database anymore. All right. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the database Trivia. All right. One thing to note about SQL, each command you are doing needs to end in a semicolon. All right. So that's one thing I notice a lot of people always forget. Make sure you end it with a semicolon. Another thing to note is all the commands in pSql are usually represented as all caps, but they actually don't need to be in all caps, but that's just a thing people generally do. All right, so now we've created our database, and I can confirm with \l that now I do have my Trivia database. So now let me connect to my Trivia database with \c on the database name called Trivia. Now I'm connected to my Trivia database. So now here I can say DL to see all the different tables associated with it. Well, since I just created the database, I don't have anything. As we can see, there's nothing inside of our database. Perfect. Awesome. So now we can kind of exit out of here for now. And the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to kind of put in, or we're going to populate our database with pre-made stuff that I already made. All of this information is inside of the GitHub. If you go back to the GitHub, there's a file called trivia.psql. All right, so you want to actually get this file. It's basically just pSql code that creates the table and it pre-populates it with some questions. That way we have at least some information we can kind of work with. All right. You can either download it, copy and create a new file, whatever works for you. All right. So here, what I'm going to do is you might want to go back to where you have your front end code that you have from last time. If you don't have it, that's totally fine too. It just makes things a little more organized. So here I have my back end, and here it has all the starter code, including that trivia.psql. All right. Another thing to note, inside of the actual trivia.psql code, you may want to change this line right here on 17 if your user is not Postgres. So make sure it's the user you have. Otherwise, you'll run into some errors. All right. All right, so now we can get this started. So I'm going to open up this, go into my backend, and we'll notice that we have all the files available here. So now here we're going to pre-populate our database using the .psql file that we have. And to do that, we're going to just run the command psql, saying what database we are accessing, and we're going to populate it using this specific file. So we're going to say psql trivia, and we're going to populate it with trivia.psql. Essentially, we're just going to apply all the psql code and apply it to our trivia database. And here it runs the actual commands where it creates the table, it alters the table so that we have an owner, and we insert 19 questions into our database.
Hey, Eddie, can you send this doc in the chat?
Yes, that'll be very helpful.
Thanks. Keep going.
Yeah, no problem. And yeah, feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Yes, all right, so now we have our database. It is filled, and we can actually double check that by going inside of our psql, making sure we are a Postgres user, and then making sure we connect to our trivia database. And then here we can just do a simple select star from, and then here we need to specify the table, in which case it's called questions. And here we can see all the different values that we inserted. So now we have all this stuff in our database. They're just random questions. So yeah, awesome. All right, so now that's basically it for our database. That's all we really need to do. We just need to create the database, also make sure we have a table, and having more data in it will just make things a lot easier to see and read. But that's optional if you want. But yes, that's basically it for our database end. It's probably one of the easier parts of today, and I just want to make sure we get through that as soon as possible. All right, so the next thing we're going to work on is actually doing Flask. So now Flask is, like I said, specifically going to be used to actually accept the different requests from our front end. And I'll go more into requests and all of that stuff in a little bit. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have all of our external libraries and everything set up. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to basically install everything from our requirements.txt file. And again, I simplified it, so this is all we really need. It'll actually install all the different dependencies that these libraries need to make it just a lot simpler. All right. So depending on your kind of your environment, you might need to, you can also install them using pip. I'm going to install it directly from Python using pip, just because my end it's a little messed up and I don't really have pip working. but feel free to use pip or pip3, I think is the thing now we can use. Yes, I'm just going to be installing it using -r and specifying which file I'm going to install it with. Requirements.txt. All right, and oh, I got to make sure I say pip install, all right, because I need to say what I am doing with pip. All right, so pip install all the stuff inside of the requirements. And I already have it installed, but you'll probably see all the stuff loading in. Don't worry about this error. That's a me error. Probably won't happen on you. Anyone else who has homebrew, this is also bad, but we'll worry about that in the future. But anyways, so we have everything installed. So the thing we're going to do next is we're actually going to create a virtual environment. Now, a virtual environment allows us to kind of close off our code area so that it's only in this space. That way we don't have to kind of worry about external things affecting our environment, essentially. All right, so if you notice, that was actually the last thing we have in our requirements txt file. All right, and yeah, I included it, and it wasn't included before, so make sure you have that included. All right, so I also included links in the document as well to also, in case you have like other questions and stuff, so definitely feel free to look at the document. There's a specific link that tells you how to use and activate a virtual environment, because it actually is slightly different between Unix, Mac, and Windows. So definitely check out the differences between the two if you're using one operating system or the other. All right, since I'm using a Mac, I'm going to follow this convention to make sure I set up an environment. For Windows, it'll be listed there. All right, so I'm going to actually create a virtual environment. So let me get that up and running. So I'm going to say Python 3 -m, and I'm going to use env, and I'm going to call my virtual environment env. Now, it's pretty simple. You can honestly call it anything you want, but typically something along the lines of like environment, virtual environment, and that's basically it. So it'll just take some time. It's going to actually set up some certain files and things we kind of need to get started. So it might take like a couple of seconds or so. All right. And then we'll also have to wait a couple of seconds to actually have it show up. But we can actually check here. And we do have our file, or folder, I should say, called env. It'll be called whatever you named it right here. So just make sure you're aware of that. All right. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to actually activate our virtual environment. All right. Again, take a look at the documentation depending on what operating system you're using, because again, it's different between Mac, Unix, and Windows. The difference is Windows, you actually need, I believe, a .bat file or something. So that's why it's very different. But yes, so for Windows, it's going to be inside of your environment folder. And inside of that, it's going to be scripts. And that's where you're going to find the activate. For Unix and Mac, we're just going to say source and go inside of env, bin, and activate. And again, env is going to be whatever folder you named it. And since I named it env, it'll be the exact same. So I'm going to say source env /bin /activate. All right, and that'll activate my virtual environment. The only downside is that it doesn't actually show like a response to let you know that it's been activated, but we know that it's activated. You could also confirm depending, you can either say which Python or where. So for instance, I'm going to say which Python. And we'll notice we're actually accessing Python from our virtual environment as opposed to directly in whatever your local system is. So that way we have our Python directly right here. Awesome. So now that we have our virtual environment set up, that's probably the most complicated thing we'll have for right now. The next thing we're going to do is actually start using Flask. Now, I think Nick mentioned it before in the past session, but Flask is actually very simple and very easy to use. That's kind of like one of the perks it has, is that the kind of like setup is so simple that you can actually get a server running in like less than 5 minutes. It's very lightweight, it's very nice, it's very fast. So that's probably one reason why you would want to use Flask, is it just makes things a lot easier to set up with. Now, scalability wise, that might be something you might want to question, but for now, we're just going to be using Flask. All right, so that's it for our requirements and that file. So what we're going to focus on right now is we're first going to focus on creating what are called our models. So far what we've done is we've created our database, creating the actual table and populating it with some values. We are actually going to focus on the kind of like the transition from our database to our Flask server, or in this case, Sql Alchemy. Now, Sql Alchemy is an ORM, or Object Relational Management system, that allows us to talk to our database from our backend server. All right. Basically, think of it as a you can write Python to actually communicate with our database without having the need to write SQL queries or anything of that sort. And Sql Alchemy is actually super simple. It's so nice, very compact. It does have a lot of complexities to it, but it's bare bones pretty easy to understand. So first things first, we're going to be working off of our models. The only model we're going to be making today is a question model, right? It's going to relate to our questions table. So let's first import all the different things that we need. So since we've installed all of our libraries, all we're going to do is we're going to say from Sql Alchemy, we're going to import the column class, the string class, the integer class, and create engine. All right. And yeah, let me full screen this so it's a little easier to read. All right, so basically all of this is different data types that relate to the data types in a database setting. In this case, Postgres. All right. So the next thing that we need to kind of import is arrays. So now, typically arrays are a little harder to work with, but for the most part in PostgreSQL, it does make it a little bit easier. So we're going to actually get it slightly different. So we're going to say from Sql Alchemy, we're going, oops, I'm going to say dialects.PostgreSQL. We're going to import array, and it's all caps too. All right, so now Sql Alchemy can actually be used for any relational database that is SQL based. So here we need to specify where you're using the dialect PostgreSQL in order to use the specific PostgreSQL array data type. All right, that's basically what we're doing right here. And then the last few ones we're going to do are from Flask Sql Alchemy. Making sure I spell that correctly. We're going to import Sql Alchemy. And those are all the imports we're going to need. Oops, actually one more. We need to import JSON. We'll get into that later. We also could import OS if we wanted to specify a different port other than the default. But for now, we're just going to make it simple and use the default port when we start up our Flask server. Okay, so the first thing we got to do is we need to have what's called the database URI, right? So currently right now, we have our database running it's running on the server. So we need to be able to access that server using the URI. This URI is basically kind of like the address or the location to that server. So there are a few different parts of that URI we need to create. First thing is going to be the database name. All right, in this case, we called it trivia. Pretty simple. The next thing we need to do is the username. All right, since I'm using the default one, it's going to be Postgres. And this is the last part of if you did a different username, make sure you change it to your username. And then also, if you added a password, we're going to include that as well. And if you want, you could include this in an environment variable so that it's not posted locally or very visible to anyone. So make sure you're very cautious with your password. But yes, in this case, since I don't have a password, I'll just leave it blank. And then the last thing is we basically need to kind of combine all of that to get the database URI. In this case, it's the path to our database. So it's just going to be Postgresql. In the past before, it used to be just Postgres, but I think on a recent update, it can now only be read with PostgresQL. So make sure it's PostgresQL here, all right? I had a hard time trying to figure that out for like the longest time. So don't forget that, all right? And then here is where we're going to have our first thing, followed by our second thing. And we're just going to easily format that to include it. This is basically just a string. So if you want to kind of like string interpolate it or string concatenate it, feel free to. I'm just breaking it down into the two different parts. The first part is going to just be the database username, followed along with a colon, because the username needs to be separated with the password using a colon. So then here is going to be the database password. All right, so here we have database username plus colon plus the password. And then here it's going to be where it's actually located. Now, here is where you would put the different URL or kind of like the route if your database is hosted. But for us, since it's on our local machine, we can easily just use localhost. And by default, most PostgreSQL databases are hosted using port 5432. All right, so that's a default thing. Hopefully you didn't change any settings to mess with any of the ports. So hopefully it's 5432, but it shouldn't be too much to kind of figure out afterwards. And then the last thing, our second part right here, is going to be our database name. And that's basically it. So now this is our path to our database. All right, PostgreSQL, making sure I have everything spelled correctly, because I know I definitely mess up from occasion. And that looks good. All right, awesome. So now we have our database URI. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to create an instance of Sql Alchemy. In this case, I'm just going to call it DB and create an instance of Sql Alchemy, basically just creating a Sql Alchemy object. Nice. So now here, the next thing we really need to do is just be able to set up our database. And this kind of process would normally be done in our backend server part. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a function so that way we have access to our DB later on when we import it into our app.py file. So I'm just going to call this setup, since it's setting up our DB. Setup DB. And I'm also going to pass in our app, which we'll get into a second. And then here we'll have our database path, which will give a default value of our database path. All right, so now this app is going to be the actual application for our server. All right, so what we need to do is set up that application. So there are basically two main things we really need to do. We need to make sure we configure it correctly, making sure that we listen to this database URI. And then we also need to be able to just create all of our database information so that our instance of Sql Alchemy has access to all of our stuff in our database in our tables. All right, so we need to configure it. The first thing that we need to do to configure is, like I said, add the database URI. In this case, it needs to be specifically Sql Alchemy, all caps, _ database URI, right? That's basically the database path that we just created. And another thing that might be very helpful is making sure we don't have a lot of like warning messages or kind of things that are cluttering up our terminal. So we're going to make sure we do Sql Alchemy wrap modifications. And we're going to set that equal to false. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our Sql Alchemy object is connected to our Flask app. So in this case, we're just going to say db.app. We're going to set it equal to our app parameter that we're going to pass in. And again, this app is going to be the actual Flask server. All right. So now here is where we've now established a connection between our Sql Alchemy object and our Flask server. And then the last thing, or the last two things, I should say, we need to initialize it. So we need to initialize the app by also passing in the app. And then the last thing is being able to create it all. So that way we have access to all of our database goodness. And that is actually it for our setup function.
You got a little typo on line 19 there. Config, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's not config, it's config. Awesome. All right. And now we're finally getting into our model aspect. So when it comes to models, think of it as we're creating some sort of Python object that represents a table in a database. So the way we're going to set it up is we're just going to make a Python class that has all the different attributes of a database called a database table. All right. And it might sound a little confusing, but it's actually very easy. So let's get that started. So we're going to create a class and we're going to call it question because it's a question object that we are dealing with. And because this is a specific Sql Alchemy model, we want to make sure we inherit from the model class directly from our database. So we're going to make sure we inherit from db.model. This kind of does a lot of the background stuff that we don't have to worry about. All right, next thing we have to do is we need to actually give it a table name. Make sure that this is exactly the same name as what we gave it in our database. In this case, in our .p SQL file, I named it questions. So we need to make sure it's questions. If you somehow ended up changing it, make sure you change it to whatever it is that you want. All right. And now the next thing we're going to do is we need to kind of like make sure that our values are associated to the different values in our database. All right. So in the front end part, our question consisted of three main things: text, the answers, and the correct one. Unfortunately, text is a reserved keyword in PostgreSQL, so I renamed it to question, and I'll get into that later of when we need to change it to make sure it doesn't mess up with our front end. But I'll get into that later. Another thing we need to have is we need to have an ID. Now, this is just a very common thing, especially when dealing with databases. Usually an entry in a database will have some sort of ID to kind of keep track of how many things you have. and to be a unique value so that you can distinguish the different values in your database table. So we're just going to create a variable called ID, and it's going to be a column, and we need to specify what type it's going to be. Now, this is kind of, if you're familiar with SQL or PostgreSqL, this might seem familiar. If not, just know that these are just the different data types we're dealing with in our PostgreSqL. All right. In this case, it's going to be an integer, and it's also going to be a primary key. I'm going to make sure that is true. Now, when it comes to primary keys, that's a database thing that lets the database know that this is kind of like the main indicator for this table. Usually it's an ID of some sort, so that's why we're setting our primary key to our ID. All right, next thing is going to be a question, which is just going to be a column. In this case, it's just going to be a string. And here we are going to have our answers. Now this one's a little different, but it's going to be a string array. So we're going to make sure it's from a column. And this is where we're going to use our array class that we inherited, and making sure it's a string array. And then last but not least, we're going to have our correct value, which is just going to be an integer. All right, perfect. So now we've kind of set up the data types for our model. The last things we got to do are create a constructor function to be able to actually create the actual object, and also create some methods to actually apply them to our Sql Alchemy database. All right, so let's create a constructor function. So underscore init self, and here we're going to pass in 3 things. Now, because our ID is a primary key, and we've kind of set it up so that it automatically registers whenever you add a new value, we don't need to worry about ID. So the only things we really need to worry about are question, answers, and the correct. So we'll say question, answers, and correct as parameters. And then here, just like other classes that you might be familiar with in Python, we're just going to create attributes for this object. So we're going to say self.question equals question. We're going to say self.answers equals answers, and self.correct equals correct. All right. Pretty simple stuff. Now, the next thing we're going to do is create some sort of methods. Now, we may not need to use all of these methods right now, and we may not even get into all of the methods now, but I'll just create them because they're actually quite simple and make it easy. So if you want to add the optional stuff that we'll go over later on, feel free to. But yes, so what we're focusing on right now is the way that Sql Alchemy works is that it's very similar to Git, in the sense that in order to actually make a change to our database, you first need to add it to a session. Kind of like how you would in Git, you would need to add something, and then you would need to commit that change, right? So this is also why Sql Alchemy is kind of intuitive and very easy, is that it works very similarly to Git. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an insert method. So this is basically going to handle us inserting a question directly into our database. All right, and because we already have our DB instance created right here that is now connected to our database, whenever we reference DB, we're really connecting to our database through Sql Alchemy. So here we're going to say db.session to kind of create this specific session, and we're going to add the specific object that we just created, or in this case, self. So now we've added it to our session. We just need to commit it to actually make that change to our local database. So we're going to say db.session.commit. And that's it. It's very easy. So we're just going to add a few more. The next one we'll do is update. This one's even easier. The reason why it's easier is because whenever we do any kind of like update in general, most of that work, the code is going to be from the server side. So all we really need to do is just say db session dot commit. And that's because when we have access to this question object, we can actually just manually change the attributes like question, answers, or correct, and it will actually change it in the session itself. So that's where we're going to handle all of that stuff. So that's why we only really need to just commit it. And then the last thing is delete. Also, another relatively easy one is basically going to be the same as add, except we're deleting instead. So we need to access our session. We need to make sure we delete self. And we need to also commit. And there we go. Pretty easy stuff. And now, another final thing we need to do, and this is mostly to help the front end aspect, is to format it so that it's in a proper form that the front end can use. And because the front end uses text instead of question, this is where I'm going to make sure we use text instead of question. So to do that, I'm just going to create another method. I'm just going to call it format. In which case, it's literally just going to return a Python dictionary. The reason why we want it to be a dictionary is we're going to eventually convert it into a JSON, which will then eventually be converted into a JavaScript object in our React end. And converting a Python dictionary to a JavaScript object is very simple. So that's why we're making it like this. So the main things we're going to have are ID, which is going to be self.id. And I think, oh yeah, that's one thing I forgot to add as well. In our constructor function, we're going to say self.id equals ID. And then back to our dictionary, we want to say text, making sure that it is self.question, right? And if you're working on like a different application, just make sure that whatever values you have here are the values you have on your front end. Right? This is basically the only kind of thing the back end needs to worry about. The front end is making sure it knows what values it needs, so that way we are sending the correct stuff. Answers, and last but not least, correct, in which case it's going to be self.correct. All right, and that is all we need for our models. So to kind of review, we created our database URI, making sure we can connect to our database server, establishing a connection using Sql Alchemy, making sure it's configured to that URI and our Flask app. And then we also created a model specifically for a question that represents a question in our database. All right, awesome.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So if we didn't need to change text to question, but we still need to have this format function, or does do we need to create a dictionary as an intermediate step, or can Flask convert models to JSON relatively easily?
Yeah, so that is a thing. Yeah, I believe Flask can convert it into a dictionary by default. But it's just also very helpful to just have this available so you are familiar with what it is you're sending.
Yeah.
So normally this would be like a good thing to have. I think it's not necessary, but yes, I think it auto converts into a JSON. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Okay. Plus, yeah, I guess I imagine you wouldn't necessarily want to always send all the information anyways. So
right, exactly. Like there might be some like relational data or like, say you have like a users table, right? That has like a password column. You're obviously not going to send your password, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, that can limit what you're sending. Perfect. Awesome. So now we've set up our model. Now finally we can start our Flask. But it's actually very simple, like I've said before. So it shouldn't take too long. All right, so here, let me just get it set up and we can get going. All right, so kind of like how we did our models, we need to import some Flask things so that way we can use Flask. So let's start off with all of our imports. So from Flask, we're going to import Flask itself. We're also going to use request, since that'll be very helpful. We could use abort. Abort is mostly used for error purposes. This is an optional thing, but I'll include it anyways in case you want to include some sort of like error checking. And we're also going to have Jsonified, because we want to be able to Jsonify our dictionaries essentially. And then here we also need to import Flask Sql Alchemy, and we're going to specifically import from that Sql Alchemy. And then last but not least, we need to use something called cores. Now, cores is the cross, I forget exactly what it stands for, but it allows us for cross-origin
Resource sharing.
resource sharing. Yeah, thank you. Basically, what that means is, as a user, let's say you try to make an access to or make a request to some sort of server, right? You, as a user in that computer, you only know the location of wherever that information is located. So it knows to go to that server. But if this server happens to actually depend on other servers to collect its information, that is what's called kind of the cross-origin resource, right? That allows us to kind of like make sure that whenever we send a request, that we can actually go to other places to get the information and data that we need. And because we have our database server that is different from our Flask server, our React server needs to allow all of that kind of like talk between all of these servers to get all the information we want. So that's why we need cores. So we're going to import cores. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to get all the stuff from our models. So we're going to say from models, we're going to import our function we created. So our setup DB function, as well as the question class model we created. Awesome. So now to actually create a Flask application, all we really need to do is just create a Flask instance and give it some sort of name. In this case, I'm just going to say underscore underscore name underscore underscore. That I believe represents kind of like the name of its current location. This part is not necessarily important. Just know that we just need to create a Flask instance. Then the last thing, there's a lot more we're going to do. What we need to do next is we need to actually call our setup function. So now here's where we're going to actually call our setup DB. And because we created our application already, we're just going to pass in our app as so. And because we've imported our function from a different environment, it has all the necessary information to access the Sql Alchemy object from models. So we don't have to worry about any of that. And this just makes it a little more organized. So that way our app.py file only has to deal with server related code. It has nothing to do with database information. All right. Makes it a lot cleaner. All right, and now we need to kind of apply cores. So we're just going to use cores, making sure we use app. And we could add more options and stuff here as like kind of like a security purposes. But for now, we can easily just do cores app to make sure that we are allowing cores to be set on this server. Without this, we'll run into a lot of issues where we actually can't connect to our database. So make sure you have that. All right. And now we're going to get into a lot of more interesting stuff. So let me actually go back to our document that we have over here. Yep. So far we've created a virtual environment. We did all of our Postgres model stuff. We basically set up Flask. The next thing is we need to allow methods. This just basically means we want to use different HTTP request methods. All right. And I listed the two main methods we're going to be using, get and post. I also listed out what HTTP requests are. But for those who don't know what they are basically ways to kind of specify what it is that we want. For instance, a get request means that we're just trying to get information from some sort of location. So for instance, when you search up google.com, your browser knows to actually make a get request that sends it to Google servers to only get the HTML JavaScript code for Google and send it back to you. Now, when you actually search something up on Google, for instance, if you search up pictures of dogs, you're actually sending data included with that request. That request would actually be a post request. A post request is basically sending information along with this other information that requests have, and you send it to that server. That server then needs to understand that, hey, this is a post request and it has this specific data. So the purpose behind a server is to know what kind of requests I am getting and how do I handle each type of request and what it is that I need to do. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to go through different routes that we're going to create and make sure we kind of get through them. So what we're going to be doing are two specific routes. We're going to get questions, basically being able to get all the questions. That way our React app can actually show all the questions. And we're going to actually post a question to be able to create a new question. And there's other ones you can include as well, as update and delete. Those are optional ones that we may get to later on, but we'll see how time goes on. Yes, those are other things that you can kind of go along. And that the reason why I mention these is because these follow what's called Crud. Now, Crud is something you might have heard. It's basically create, read, update, delete. This is your basic structure for a very simple web application. When dealing with some sort of database, you would want to be able to create something. You want to be able to read it. You'd want to be able to update it and delete it. Those are kind of like the core functionality you would want to include with your back end. But we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll see. All right. So again, we're going to be mainly focusing on our get and post routes. All right. So that's all the information we really need to know. And if you want to take a look at the links here, go for it. All right. So back to our code. So we're going to start working on these routes. And now the routes are actually quite simple. So for instance, if we want to kind of say, I want to go to a specific route, all I would need to say is @app.route. And here is where I would specify the route that I am going to. In this case, if I say /, that's going to be the main route, or basically nothing after the URL of the base URL. In our case, it's our local host. And then after I kind of declare the route, I need to specify what happens with that route, right? I need to be able to handle what happens. In this case, in Flask, you need to create a function which will get called to have you do whatever it is you need to do, right? In this case, I'll create a simple function called index and just have it return the string hello there, right? This right here, we're not going to be using this route. This is just it for testing purposes to make sure that we can actually see something. So let's see if we can get our Flask server up and running. But before we do that, we need to actually run our app. So what we're going to do is at the very bottom, you might have seen this in quite a lot of like Python code, but we're going to check to make sure that if this is kind of like the main file, we're just going to say app.run. And then here is where, alternatively, if you want to use a different port for your Flask server, that's where you would put it inside of here. I think by default, Flask uses port 5000, which actually is fine because it doesn't interfere with React or a Postgres server. So it totally works out. So now with all of that and making sure we save it, we can now try running it. So let's do Python 3 app.py. And you can also run it through like your code editor, but I have some problems with VS Code and it doesn't work for me. So I'm just going to be doing this. Ah, nice. No module named Flask. All right, let me try to redo that again. There we go. So if you see that error, it's most likely because now that we've activated our virtual environment, we need to kind of reinstall all of our libraries. So make sure you do that command to install all of your libraries so that it has access to it inside of the virtual environment. I forgot to do that. So now if we do this, we should see that it is loading and going to be hosted on port 5000. Nice. I misspelled localhost. And I'm assuming that is inside of the models and right here. Perfect. There we go. Don't you just love when like you're presenting something and it just always happens to fail, regardless of how many times you've perfected it? Right. So yes, it's running at this location right now. Basically, localhost is 127.0.0.1, so that's why it's there. All right, so I think I just go like that, and here we go. And because this is the home route, it actually gets the value that we are returning, which is hello there. All right. So if we really want, we could also have our Flask server be our front end if necessary. But because we have already established a front end using React, which definitely has its benefits and stuff, that's definitely, we're going to leave all of that for that. So our Flask server is mostly going to handle requests. So we're not going to be able to see anything using this. So we're not going to be using our localhost 5000 to actually visually see anything. All right. All right. And then the next thing we're going to do is try to get some of these routes up and running. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to be able to try to get the questions, because that one is something we can actually visually see. All right. So we can kind of leave this here for now. If not, you can always delete it. I'll just leave it so that it doesn't kind of like error out when we actually see it on the localhost page. But yes. All right. So now let's go to a route to actually get the questions. So again, in order to set up a route, I need to declare it by saying app.route. And In this sense, typically, because we are a back-end server, we can kind of think of this back-end server as some type of API. Now, an API is, and I always forget the acronyms for things. I think it's like application interface, something along those lines. Essentially, it just boils down to being able to handle different things and send the correct information when needed. Right? That's basically what a backend server is just an API. And our purpose is we're just sending all the questions we have in our database. Now, typically, this route can actually be anything you want. It can be /potato, it can be / whatever you want. But because we are kind of like following conventions, we're going to specify that it is API. And here we're also going to say that we're trying to get questions. All right. And another thing to note, if you notice, we actually are not specifying what HTTP method we are using. And that's because this route method defaults to the get method. All right, and we'll get into that after to actually show you how to change that. But yes, we are getting this specific route. All right, so to handle it, I'm going to create a function called getQuestions. These function names don't necessarily matter. They're just for your purposes. So normally you'd want to call them something that means something of what they're doing. That way, if you happen to want to do something in a different route that is similar to one of these functions, you can always call it afterwards. But the names don't necessarily matter. Okay, so here is probably going to be one of the few times we're going to be actually interacting with our Sql Alchemy database. All right, so we are going to just access that from our question. So in order to do that, we're just going to create a variable, and we're going to access our question model. And what we're going to do is we're going to query it and be able to get all of the data inside of it. Now, this right here is all Sql Alchemy code. What this does is what this is doing in the background is it's actually creating SQL queries and actually doing a select asterisk from our questions table. But because we don't have to necessarily know SQL to use this, we could just do this, right? Makes things, again, a lot easier, very simple. So now here is where we get all of our questions. So the easy thing that we really have to do is format our question, or in this case, making sure we call our format method to make sure that we apply any format so that way we send the correct information. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to create a separate variable so it's a little different from our questions. So that way we're not actually sending a Sql Alchemy object. I'm just going to create an entirely new list. So I'm just going to call it QList to represent the list of questions we have. And I'm going to kind of just format all of our questions as so. So I'm going to say q.format for q in questions. Basically, I'm going through all of the questions. Because this is a Sql Alchemy model object, we actually can iterate through it, which is why we can use this for loop to actually go through them, being able to get each individual question and call its format method on it. So that way we now have an array of dictionaries. Nice. And the last thing we really need to do is just be able to return it. Now, one thing we need to do beforehand is we need to JSONify it. Now, JSONs are basically, if anyone's familiar with JavaScript object, it's a specific notation that is very strict, but also very useful to know. The reason why we the reason why we're using JSON is because it's actually very easy to send that data in this format. There are different formats you actually can send stuff with your HTTP request, but I find it that JSONs are probably the most easy to use, and especially if you're using a JavaScript framework for your front end, JSONs are probably the easiest thing you can do, so that way your front end can handle those as normal JavaScript objects. But I'm pretty sure there's other formats we can use as well. I just find that JSONs are just a lot easier to deal with. So we're going to JSONify it from the import that we had earlier. And we're just going to return that JSONified list. And that's it. Very simple. Getting our questions from our Sql Alchemy database, being able to format each one of those questions so that we are sending the correct data, making sure we format it into a JSON and sending that back. All right, so now we can actually visually see if this is working. What we need to do is just go to this route and we should be able to get that information. All right, so now here, let's try to go to API/questions. So if I go here, going back to my local host, and here I go to /API/questions, I get not found. And that's actually as expected. Now, this is one thing I wanted to point out, is every time you make a change on your server, specifically our Flask server, we need to restart the server so that we can apply those changes. There are, I forget exactly what it is, but there are kind of like libraries that can auto update it as we're kind of making changes. But that's one thing I wanted to point out. In general, whenever you make a change to your server, you would most likely need to restart it so that it applies those changes. So I'm just going to cancel it, restart it, going back over here. And if I refresh my page, I'm getting the JSON, which is the array of dictionaries of all of our questions in our database. Nice. So our server is working, and it's actually connecting to our database using Sql Alchemy. Pretty nice. Awesome. So now we have our get all questions route pretty much done. All right. And then the next route we're going to do is the one to handle creating a question. That one's actually going to be fairly easy as well, but there are some differences that we will need to account for. Because we are creating something, we are going to be sending information to this route, right? We need to specify what's the question, what are the answers, and even which one is the correct answer, right? We need to send all of that information to this specific route to actually create an object and insert it into our database. All right, so that's what we're going to have to handle right now. And in this case, we will need to make sure we have specific values and basically error check to make sure that it is properly formatted in the way that we want. For instance, if someone tries to kind of like add something that is blank or something, we want to make sure we don't accidentally add it to our database. All right, so let's add that route. So again, it's a route, so we're going to include a new route. But in this case, what we're going to do is it's going to be the same route. But wait a second, we already have this route. Well, that's because this is going to be a post request. So we need to specify the method for this route. And we did not have to specify the method on the first one because by default, it defaults the method to get. So all we have to do is say methods equals and specify the different methods. Now, alternatively, what we could have done is because they share the same route, we could have actually just put it in one function. And inside of the function say, oh, if the method is post, do this. If the method is get, do this. We could have done that as well. But I find it a lot easier, and it makes a little bit more, makes it more clear to kind of separate them into their own individual routes, regardless of what method you're sending it. All right. So, oops, actually, no, we don't need that. Now we need to create the handler function to handle this specific route. So we're going to create another function. We're going to say add question. All right. So now here, this is where we're going to actually get the request. So because we are actually importing a request from Flask, and we are using a Flask server, we can actually check to see requests that were sent to our server without the need of actually pretty much anything. So for instance, if we were to just print our request right here, we can actually print and see all of the contents of what a HTTP request is given to us. All right. But we're not going to print it out because it's a lot of complicated stuff that's not necessary to see, but we can actually just use request regardless of where we're at. We don't need to define it because Flask kind of changes it whenever it receives a request. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of just get that information and be able to kind of check to make sure it's kind of like correct information. Then we're going to actually create an instance of our question object and then actually apply it to our database. All right, so first things first, we're going to get the form data. Now, the form data is basically the data we get from our form, from our front end stuff, right? I think we created like a text area with like inputs, and then we kind of just converted that into some sort of thing and just added it to your front end. We'll go into how we can actually connect our front end with our database once we're done with this function. So to actually get the form data, we're going to use our request and we're going to convert it to a JSON. Yay, JSONs, very helpful. In this sense, because we're in Python though, we're actually converting it into a dictionary. Dictionaries, yeah. All right, so now we have our form data. All right, the next thing we're going to do is typically you would want to check to make sure that you have valid information and also make sure that there's no harmful things that apply to your database. Now here, I think I mentioned this in the previous full stack web series, but in this case, I actually didn't look into it, but this is where you would want to kind of serialize or kind of like make sure that the data you get is clear of any scripts or kind of malicious intent, because someone can actually create like database queries to actually grab the information and stuff. So this is like the place where you would kind of like cleanse it and kind of strip it from all of that information. All right, that's just something I wanted to mention. All right, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a try statement. The reason why we want to do a try statement is because in the off chance that we can't actually insert our question that we create into our database, we need to make sure that we do something just in case. All right, so in this case, we're going to try to create a new question. So we're going to create a new variable. And in this case, we're actually going to create a new question instance. So we're going to be using our question model. And we're going to pass in all the three things that we need to pass in: the question, the answers, and the correct. So question, we're going to give it the value of our form data. But in this case, it's going to be text. All right. Remember how we formatted it to be text? It's still going to be text in our front end. So we need to make sure that we use text here as well. All right. it's going to follow kind of like the convention of whatever it is in the front end. All right. And then the next thing is our answers. And it, again, is going to be our form data with our answers. Right. And again, our form data is literally just a dictionary. So that's how we're accessing the values inside of the dictionary with these different keys. And correct, making sure I spell that correctly, is form data correct. And there we go. And to kind of maybe make this a little bit clearer to read, I'm just going to separate it on different lines. So that way we have all of the things on individual lines, make it easier to read. And there we go. So yeah, we're creating a new question, passing in all of our stuff from our form data. And making sure we get our text answers in correct. Now that we have this new object, we need to actually insert it into our database. And the way we're going to do it is by calling the insert method that we created way back in our models. So if we take a look at our model again, we created the insert method. So all we really need to do is just call this method on that new question object to actually insert it into our database. Pretty simple stuff. So we're going to say new question dot insert. And what we defined it to do before is add it to the session and commit it to make that change. So now this is also another reason why we're doing a try statement, because there can be errors at multiple places, whether it's the form data not getting the correct information, whether it's our Sql Alchemy not being able to actually add it to the session, or not even being able to commit it to the session, right? There's a lot of places where errors can occur. So to make sure we don't mess up anything with our database or with our server, we're just going to put it inside of a try statement. And we probably could have done the exact same thing for our questions as well. But because there's not too many kind of like places where we can get an error, it's not necessarily needed. And because we know we already have questions, we will at least get something. And even if there weren't questions, we would just get an empty array regardless. All right. And then here, we're just going to do an except. And in this case, this is where you would do some sort of error message. I might actually do the error messages later on, but we'll see. But for right now, what we're going to do is we're just going to like return something went wrong, just temporarily for now. We'll get into how to actually do probably a little proper error later on, but we'll see how much time we have left. Okay, so now with that, because we have a return here, we can actually just continue our code as if we went through the try statement. All right, so the last thing we really need to do is very similar to what we did in our get route, is be able to return a Jsonified object. So we're going to return our Jsonified question. In this case, the one thing we really need to return is just a way to say that, was this inclusion to our database successful? And since it was included, what is the ID associated to the object that we inserted it into? Now, the reason why we want to at least return the ID is because that's the only information the front end does not have access to when it sends that request. When it sends that request, it's sending the question, the answers, and the correct. Well, the only reason why we need to send that information is so it can get saved into our database, but it's still there when we send the request. So the only thing we really need to send back is the newly added stuff of the ID that was created when it was actually inserted. So we're just going to kind of send a return request that says, or a return message that says, hey, it was successfully added. Here's the associated ID with it. So that way, if you need to do something with that object in our database, you can use that ID to do whatever it is that you want to do. So what we're going to do is create a simple dictionary that has those two things, a success message and the ID. So we're going to say success. And in this case, just easily set it as true. It was a success. And here we'll say ID and give it the new question.id. Perfect. All right. And that is it for those two routes. All right. Now that we have these two routes, let's now try to kind of connect it to our front end part. All right. And like I said, if we have time, we can maybe go through the other routes, but those are actually going to be a little more tricky to deal with because we're going to be using query parameters. So when it comes to like deleting or update, not only are we kind of like passing in data to say how it's being updated, but we also need to specify what value in our database we are updating or deleting. All right, so that ends up getting to be a little more tricky. But for now, let's focus on integrating all of the code we have into our front end. And this is actually going to be fairly easy because we only need to worry about one thing, and that is our quiz component. So going back into your React app, what we really need to do is go to our components and access our quiz. Now, this is the code from last time, so if you don't have it, definitely take a look at the Discord, which I'm sure Nick has it posted up. This is the exact same thing that he had, the code he had from the live demonstration. So there should be no changes or anything. All right. So if we take a look at our React component, this is what we did. We basically had to use the useEffect hook to create dummy questions, right? So now this is literally the area where we want to be able to call our Flask server and get all of our questions instead of using dummy data, right? And then once we get all the information, then we can set the questions as well as set the selected answers. So this is the first thing that we're going to change, right? So here, I'm just going to, or actually for this purpose, I'm going to actually run the actual code so that we can actually see it right now. So we can see that it's using the dummy data. And then I'm going to change it so that way we can see that we're using the database data. All right. So let me cd into my front end code. And in this case, I think I need to install all the npm stuff. And then once I get that, I can do npm start to actually start the React server so we can actually see the front end stuff. And all that npm stuff is, okay, so there's audited. I think this actually should be fine. Yeah, that actually should be fine. So now let me see, npm start. All right. So all npm start is doing is it's just looking at the package JSON file and actually running a React specific function to actually start the app itself. Basically, it starts the server and kind of loads all the code into it so that we can actually visually see it. All right. And then going back here, it's starting the server. Once it's fully loaded, we can see that it's, I believe it's hosted on port 3000. And then once that's up and running, we can actually see, and we can see our dummy data. All right. I'll put that on the screen right now. And here we have our dummy data. All right. And we have question 1 with answer 0, 1, 2. Question 1 with how are you, great, not so great. Right. That's exactly the same dummy questions we have right here. And if I were to basically, let me comment all of this out and refresh this page. It should not show up, but that's fine. As long as we know that it's working, it's working. So what we're going to do is I'm going to actually comment out all of this out just temporarily. And here I'm going to actually call a request to my Flask server, specifically asking for all the questions. All right. So to actually do that, we're going to be using what's called fetch. So fetch is actually a built-in JavaScript function that actually kind of makes requests for you. There's other ways you can do it as well. I think the pretty popular one to use is Axios. Axios has a lot more kind of like customizable things associated with it. So if you want to take a look into that, I can send you a link for that too if you want. But fetch is good enough for our purposes right now. So we're just going to be doing a fetch call. So basically what fetch does is we need to say what URL it is that we are trying to fetch, and then we're going to do something based off of this, right? We need some sort of input, and it's going to return what's called a promise. For those who don't know what a promise is, the simplest way I can kind of put it is it's some type of JavaScript object that has some sort of task. This task can actually take a varying amount of time. Because we are actually sending some sort of request to a completely different server, there's going to be some sort of delay until we get something in return, whether that's like a fraction of a second or whatever. It's going to be taking some amount of time. So once that task has been complete, the promise can then say it has finished that task in order to continue doing whatever it needs to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to fetch. In this case, we're going to go to HTTP 127.0.0.1, and specifically, we're going to go to port 5000. But since we're trying to get all of the questions, we're going to say API/questions, right? We're going to that specific route. So what is happening now is we are making a HTTP request, and by default, fetch uses a GET request. And because we want to use a GET request, that works for us. So now it's going to send a request to our Flask server to be able to get all of the questions, right? And because what we get in return is a promise, we can do these .thens. Now, .thens allow us to do something once that promise task has been completed. It's basically just need to say, we need to pass in some sort of function handler to say what we need to do next after the task has been completed. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a very simple anonymous function. What we are going to be getting back is a response. So I'm going to represent it as res. And in this case, what we want to do to start off is we are going to get some sort of response object. Now, this response object is going to be very complicated. It's going to have a lot of information that we as a developer don't really want or don't really need. Mostly it's kind of information to know, like how to get to its location, a lot of metadata, stuff that is actually a lot of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're just going to immediately convert it into a JSON because we love JSONs here. All right. So here we're going to just say, I want to convert this into a JSON. I don't want any other unnecessary information. I just want it to be a JSON, right? And because we are now in JavaScript land, we can now interpret it as a JavaScript object, all right? And because this is some sort of process that may or may not take some sort of amount of time, it is also returning a promise. So what we can do with this is we can do another .then. All right. And in this case, we're going to create another function. In this case, we're getting some sort of data. In our purpose, we know it's going to be all the questions. Right. So if I were to do something like console.log here, I would see an array of JavaScript objects with all the necessary information. In this case, it'll look very similar to dummy questions, which is exactly what we want. All right. So what we're going to do here is essentially do these things inside of our .then. And in this case, instead of using dummy questions, we're actually going to be using data. So that way we set our questions and we also set the selected answers. All right. So now if I save this and reload our React app, what happened here? Let's see. Do we have a problem here? Fetch.then res JSON. It is saved. Interesting. All right, so we have some errors in our console. Those don't look to be something that's preventing this from happening. Class name, that's okay, so we do see that we did make a request here. And we did get a 200 response. So we do know that is good. Interesting. Let me actually see console.log. Making sure we, oops. I'm gonna try this. Restarting the server. And also, interesting. It looks like I'm not even getting that console.log. Okay, I need to maybe double check. I could actually be having another server that's up and running. So I need to double check that. No, I don't have that ready. Huh. Restart React. Oh no. So I think what could be happening is, I think this is probably an error on my computer. It could be something along, because when I started the React thing, there was a lot of like warnings and stuff. There's probably something wrong with my like node module installation where it doesn't actually recognize some of the kind of like necessary things for React to actually work. So I think that's probably why it's doing all this stuff. Still starting up. The thing about
so we don't see the data at all, right? We get the response, but wait, when you log the data, what do we see?
Let's see. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so now we're actually getting database information. So hopefully on your end, it should be working. So I think for me, I just need to restart my React server, because normally with React, you don't need to do that. But I think probably because of my computer, I've been having a lot of computer issues lately. So hopefully you're not having nearly as many computer issues as me. It should be working fine. But yes, we have all of our questions from our database. Nice. Awesome. So now we're getting our questions. Awesome. And it should be working exactly the same way where once you press submit, it should also say which ones you got right and stuff. And that's what we did on the front day when we did it last week. All right. But the next thing we want to worry about right now is being able to create a new question. So we're able to kind of create a new question easily right here. And it will actually display it on our front end, right? So if I were to kind of like say all of this and create like a new question and add it as a question, it shows it here on the front end. But if I try to refresh the page, it's going to actually grab all the information from the database, and that question has not been added to the database, so it's not added at the end. So that's what we're going to try to fix right now. So going back to our code, we can kind of now delete this dummy data that we don't need anymore. And we have that pretty much done. So this part is actually going to be easier than what we did before, but with a little more things added. So if you recall, the way that we set up our React is that we have a button to actually add that question, right? So taking a look here, we have this add question button. So whenever we click on it, it actually calls the function on click, our, oh, not submit answers. I think it was, where was it? New question. Yeah, it was inside of our new question component where it had that button, it would actually submit it. In this case, it's using the add question function, right? So all it's doing right now is basically just adding all of that information and adding it to our state. It's not really doing anything with our database. So we need to do something with our database. So very similar to what we did when we got all of our questions, we need to make a fetch request, right? But this is going to be a slightly different fetch request because we are going to be sending data to our server. We need to make a post request. So let me show you how to actually make a post request using fetch, right? So here we're going to be doing fetch. In this case, again, we need the same URL. In this case, it's going to be the same localhost 127.0.0.1 with a port of 5000. I'm pretty sure you can use localhost too, but I prefer to write it out fully just to make sure. In this case, it's going to be the same path as, or the same route questions. But in this case, we also need to pass in different options to specify or basically change the settings of the request. So what we're going to do is add a second parameter, which is kind of like the options for this fetch. In this case, since we're in JavaScript land, most things are object, so we're going to create an object. Inside of the object, we need a few things to kind of clarify. First being method. That's probably the most important part. Because we don't want to default it to the get method, we need to specify that it is going to be a post method. All right. And I can't think off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure you want to make sure it's all caps. I'm not sure if it's case sensitive, but don't quote me on that. All right. The next thing we need to do is we need to, since we're actually sending information, we need to kind of make sure that we not necessarily allow, but also specify what type of data we're sending. In this case, we need to change something in our headers. So in this case, we need to specify the content type, because the way that requests work is that as it gets a request, it actually looks for these specific values to know what it needs to do with that value. So we will specify the content type. In this case, we're going to say that it is an application JSON. If we ended up using a different type instead of JSON, we would need to set it here. All right. Now that we've set the headers, we also need to make sure that we allow cores. So we're also going to make sure that we set mode to be CORS. That way we're able to kind of communicate and connect to the different servers that we need to in order to get all of the information. And then last but not least, we need to have some sort of body. This body is very important because this is how we're actually sending the data to our Flask server. So we include some sort of body. In this case, because we are sending a JSON, or specifically we're sending JSON data, we need to make sure we convert our JavaScript object into a JSON. So we need to stringify it. Good old stringify. And in this case, because we are actually passing in the actual question object, we just need to specify the question. And that's our fetch statement. In this case, we just needed to pass in a function to specify different settings to allow it to be a post method, right? And again, it's going to have some sort of task. So we need to wait until that task is done, meaning we're going to include a .then. And just like how we did it on the other one, we're going to get some sort of response. And with that response, we need to say, hey, I need to be a JSON because that's how I need to interpret the data. So I'm going to convert it into a JSON. All right. And then we need to wait until that is done, in which case I will need to then do something with the new data that I get. All right. So very similar to our other fetch, we have a two.thens. In this case, we know that the data we're getting back is this object right here, right? We are getting a success and we're getting an ID. All right. So normally what we can do is we can say, if it is a success, then we want to do this. So what we can say is if data, and I'm pretty sure we can do dot success. Right, and because we set it to be a Boolean, we don't need to kind of compare it. It in itself is already a Boolean, so we can do something here. In this, we just need to specify the question ID, so that way we have access to the ID with whatever it is that we need to do. So we're going to say question.id equals data.id. And then last but not least, we just need to make sure that we set our questions after. All right. Now, the reason why we want to make sure we set our questions inside of the .then is because, like I said, this fetch request might take a fraction of a second. So we want to make sure that we only do it once we get a successful addition to our database. All right. And that's it. So now let's test it out. I am going to restart my React server because computer bad. But let's test it out. All right, loads in all of the database data. Perfect. And now let's add a question. What is my name? Hopefully everyone knows this. All right, and as soon as I click add question, it should make that fetch and add it to our database. Oh, that is not a good sign. unexpected token S in JSON at position 0. All right, let's see here.
On line 52, you have continent instead of content. I don't doubt that makes a difference here.
It actually does.
It actually does, yeah, because it would be what it sends back, yeah.
Yep. Don't you just love typos?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Especially when it's like just, you know, a typo in a string that it said, so the error is like significantly later.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, because I probably would have taken forever to figure that out, but I promise you, React is a lot faster than this. It's just my computer, so don't worry about it. All right, load it up. No, I can probably also remove exclamation.logs to speed it up just a little bit. Add question. Oh, and it still has the error. Unexpected token S in JSON. Well, let's see here. In JSON.stringify question, add question. There's that JSON.
What is it saying in the response that we get? I don't know how to do it in Chrome, but check the network tab. It's giving it 200, presumably.
Let me check my database, see if it's actually here. Okay, so it did not make an actual post, but it is making the request, interestingly enough. Syntax. Oddly enough, I did not see that error.
Oh, I actually didn't notice this. Is the .json on line 25 of app.py, is that supposed to be a function? Oh wait, okay, wait. Yeah, an app.py. I feel like it's a server side error, right? If it's not getting posted. So is for you it's line 28. Do you need to call that, or is that an attribute?
Oh geez, yeah, I think I do need to call it.
Oh, okay, cool.
That's probably it. Wait, is it?
Is it? I don't know.
Let me see. All right, time for some debugging. So yeah, we can actually see the request now. Well, we can take a look to see what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure we get our form data as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that sense, all I need to do is just cancel and restart the Flask server. So it should be a lot faster. All right, and then if I try to submit again, wait, not submit, sorry, add question. And take a look at the console. Yep, we get a request object. And
Okay,
we get
so
that. So that's actually
yeah, so
fine.
that is right. Yeah, so you don't call it.
Mm-hmm. That is actually fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, it is text answers correct.
Mm-hmm.
Text answers correct form data. So it could be that there's a lot of, like I said, especially when it comes to this, there's a lot of places where it can error out.
Yeah.
It could be that it's So that's what's happening.
Aha, yeah, that makes sense.
So because it says unexpected token S in JSON at position 0, that means we are returning something went wrong because S is at the 0 position. So we know it has something to do with the try statement. So let's take a look at what's happening here. So we are creating a new question. And that might be something wrong with the models. We have question answers correct. Question answers correct. It could actually be something with the ID now that I think about it. So if I were to do this and restart the Python or the Flask server. Okay, add question. Okay. And let me take a look at the database. And
okay, cool.
All right, so it had something to do with the ID. All right, so in that sense, I think in this case, we can actually check to make sure that it doesn't have an ID. So I'm going to check one thing to make sure we do have that ID available, because we do need that ID in case you want to do like the delete or update, because we need to specify which value it is that you want to update or delete. So to easily check that, going into our quiz, we can actually see what this is. We can easily do console.log question. Now I need to restart my React, and we can easily tell to see if that's working. But we made our connection to our database, and that's good. So I'm just going to check this real quick, but I think that's basically it that we're doing. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do update or delete. I would recommend trying to do it yourself. They are probably one of the more harder ones to do, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I can try to help with any like issues you have or anything. And yeah, that's basically it.
All right, cool. Thanks. So I guess, yeah, we'll just wrap it up here. I'll throw this on the YouTube as soon as it's done processing. And yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Eddie.
Yeah, no problem.
Great. See ya.
Goodbye.